Welcome to All About Agatha, the podcast dedicated to reading and ranking every single mystery novel written by the Queen of Crime, Dame Agatha Christie. I'm Catherine Brobeck.
And I'm Kemper Donovan.
And this week, Kemper is so excited because guess what we are doing? Guess where we are going?
That's right.
We are marpling.
We are marpling at long last. Our drought is over. The heavens have opened and the rain is pouring down.
I know, and it's the beginning of a new era because we are going to get so much Marple after this.
Absolutely. We are discussing The Body in the Library, our second Miss Marple novel. Of course, our first was The Murder at the Vicarage, oh so many moons ago on this podcast and within the Christie canon, 12 years earlier. In 1930. When was The Body in the Library published, Catherine?
It was published, guess what, not by Collins Crime Club first. It was published actually in the U.S. first, in February of 1942 by Mead, of course. And then in May by Collins Crime Club.
We did mention that this book was written simultaneously with NRM, which we covered last time, and we are now in another just febrile, fertile period of Christie's writing. I believe that she wrote no fewer than 4 books within the space of a year, including this one, and some gems that we have yet to cover, but we'll do so soon.
And I will note that this book is relatively short.
This has to be one of the shortest Christie's. It's barely over 200 pages.
Right. And I think that we can quibble on this later, but there might be some issues with that too.
Which is not something that we've ever, I think, faulted a Christie novel for before. We certainly have found past novels to be a little bloated, perhaps. I don't know if I would actually make that criticism, but it sounds like you might, Catherine, that this one might be a little too efficiently told or just not told enough.
Yeah. Listen, I am not one for a bloated novel, but we can talk about this later.
Well, let's talk about our murder victims because we do have 2. Mm-hmm. Our first is Ruby Keene, an 18-year-old dancer who has been strangled to death and left in the library of Gossington Hall, the home of, wait for it, Colonel Arthur Bantry and his wife Dolly. It's the Bantrys!
The Bantrys!
And back at Gossington Hall, too, which is where the second half of the 13 Problems took place. So couldn't be more excited about that. I think there's a lot of shade thrown at Ruby, including by Miss Marple herself, in terms of her low class.
Oh, yeah. It's like she's worthless.
It's very snobbish. And I think the name Ruby Keene, to me, sticks out. Christie's original name for Ruby was Queenie, which I think is even more like she was trying to indicate, I think, with the name that this was someone who did not fit within the polite circles that we are moving among in terms of most of these other characters. It goes along with her cheap clothes and her heavy makeup and her platinum hair and all of that. It's a little flashy and a little loud.
Yeah, I agree.
But yes, that is at least who our first victim appears to be. Who does our second victim appear to be, and where does she appear to have been found, Catherine?
Pamela Reeves is a 16-year-old girl guide who is burned to death in a car outside of Danemouth, which is a nearby city, albeit in another county.
Right. And I assume a girl guide is sort of like a Girl Scout in the U.S.
It's a Girl Scout.
Yeah.
You know, about the cookies, I know it's customary in order to raise funds to sell cookies door to door, and that's adorable. But wouldn't it save time and a little shoe leather if we just had a star-studded telethon? Huh?
Who are you?
Johnny could host, or Merv. Be fabulous.
Who are you?
Phyllis Neffler, Troop Beverly Hills.
Let's talk about our suspects because there are a lot of them, as there so often are in these Christie novels. And while this is not a closed circle mystery, there are a cast of characters in and around the area upon whom suspicion falls. The first is, not surprisingly, Colonel Arthur Bantry himself, who obviously had a girl's body found in his library.
Bantry.
This is that Christie-ish preoccupation with the cloud of guilt hanging over the innocent. We're never really instructed to believe that Colonel Bantry did it, but he truly is a suspect, and that is, in some ways, Miss Marple's main motivation for clearing this up, because she knows that it is going to ruin her dear friends, the Bantry's lives, if she doesn't figure out who done it.
Right, and he is so in the doldrums.
He's looking at his pigs.
He can't deal with anything, so he goes down to quote-unquote the farms and, like, looks at the pigs because that makes him happy.
Right.
So then we have Basil Blake, who's like a local party animal, and he's a minor player in the London film industry. Basically, he's a heathen film person, and don't we all know those?
Catherine and I certainly do, given our locale. Next up, we have Mr. Conway Jefferson, who is a wealthy amputee living at the Majestic Hotel in Danemouth. He lost his wife and son and daughter in the same plane crash that left him crippled.
So we have Mrs. Adelaide Jefferson, who's the widow of Frank Jefferson, who was Conway Jefferson's son who died in the plane crash. And she's basically now a companion to her father-in-law.
Right. And they're staying at the Majestic. And we should just mention that the Majestic Hotel is where Ruby Keene, our first victim, worked as a dancer. That will become obvious when we go through our summary, but just for clarity's sake right now. And then next up, we have Mr. Mark Gaskell, who is the widower of Rosamond Jefferson. So that was Conway's daughter who died in that same plane crash. And he, too, is a companion to Conway Jefferson, although a bit less devoted, at least seemingly, than
He has like a side of ne'er-do-well to him.
Absolutely.
And then we have Josephine Josie Turner, who is the hostess at the Majestic, which we've mentioned is the hotel. And she's also a dancer, and she is the victim, Ruby's cousin.
Then we have Raymond Starr, who is Josie's dancing partner. And then before Ruby herself dies, Josie had a little bit of an accident and couldn't dance with Raymond. So she brought in her cousin, and Raymond has been dancing with her through the season.
So on top of that, then we have George Bartlett, who is this young man who is the last person to have seen Ruby alive because he was dancing with her at the Majestic. And he's like a giant weirdo.
Well, he's so dumb, he almost can't function.
Correct.
Like, he's so dumb, it beggars belief. All right. Well, those are our suspects. Let's talk about the world as it appears to be. And we open on what Christie herself identified as perhaps her best opening in any novel. And there are many who agree. Janet Morgan, actually, who wrote the first authorized biography of Christie, has a nice little passage about how Christie often was good at depicting dream states and that sort of hazy in-between state between dreams and wakening. That's just something that she clearly was able to capture and then understood. It's a really fantastic sequence in which Dolly Bantry is dreaming about winning.
Very good.
Yeah, she's dreaming about winning at this garden show and then hearing all the sounds that she's used to hearing in her half-awake state of the maid opening up the rings in the curtain and pattering up the stairs. And then the sounds, of course, go wrong because the maid saw a body in the library. And this very short 2-page passage ends with the maid bursting into the room and saying, "Oh, madam, there's a body in the library."
Right. So poor Dolly.
Yeah, I mean, she thinks that she's still dreaming, but eventually she rouses herself. She shakes Arthur awake. He thinks she's being crazy, but sure enough, there is, in fact, a body in the library, and it's a young platinum blonde, overly made up. Her face is blue from strangulation. She's got these short nails and cheap satin party dress. I believe it is also noted that her teeth stick out.
And so Dolly's very first thought, which would probably not be mine, but it's Dolly's, is to call our friend Miss Marple. So she basically tells Miss Marple, "I need you here as soon as possible." And then Dolly sends her a car. So Miss Marple ends up arriving before the police. And so she and Dolly examine the body, which, like, you'd think Dolly would be a little bit more squeamish, but Dolly seems to have nerves of steel, I guess. Dolly and Jane pretty immediately hit upon the fact that Basil Blake, he's had a string of cheap blondes, for lack of a better phrase, down to marry Mead in recent weeks. They're discussing this while the actual police come in the form of Colonel Melchett and Inspector Slack. They basically are coming there to question Arthur. And they end up at the same talking point, which is Basil Blake.
I think it's really funny that Dolly immediately brings Miss Marple over and then shows her the body and then sits her down and she's like, well, does it remind you of anything? Because, and the italics are in there too. And it actually made me laugh aloud because it's coming right off of the 13 Problems when every single murder mystery
that's why she's calling Miss Marple, right?
She knows how good she is at solving these mysteries, and it's all because the people in question remind her of other people who she knows. And Miss Marple herself seems to be at a little bit of a loss for now, but it's kind of an ongoing runner until Miss Marple solves it. The Dolly Bantry is actually a little bit impatient and frustrated with Miss Marple that she hasn't solved it yet. She's like, oh, I thought you would solve it immediately.
But I actually, I've always loved Dolly Bantry.
Yeah.
But, I love Dolly Bantry here.
Yeah, no, this is a great Dolly Bantry book. We always have an eye on how does each book measure up when it comes to series-long characters. And we were both frustrated by how little Miss Marple there is in this book relative to other books. But the book is very much saved by these secondary and even tertiary St. Mary Mead characters, and no one more so than Dolly Bantry and even Colonel Bantry.
Yeah, the Bantrys, I mean, they might not win a gardening prize for this, but they win on character.
Yeah. And Colonel Melchett is even a character who we've seen before.
We've met before.
Basil Blake is immediately interviewed and asked about a missing platinum blonde. But as Melchett is talking to Basil Blake, a blonde appears, and her name is Miss Dinah Lee, and she is in a fit of fury for having been left drunk at a party. And they have a full-on fight in front of Melchett before Basil Blake finally says that his missing blonde is right here in the flesh.
So by the way, he has to be something of the worst person, because apparently she was super drunk at some film party and he just full on left her there.
Yeah. The relationship between Basil Blake and Dinah Lee is interesting, and we will be getting back to that because
we will be
provides a little bit of intrigue within this story. Back at the constabulary, there's a new notification on missing persons, and this is in the form of one Ruby Keene, a dancer in nearby Danemouth. And we know from the get-go that the missing persons report has been called into the police by a Mr. Conway Jefferson.
So the police bring in her nearest relation, which is Miss Josie, or Josephine Turner. She runs the parties at the hotel, and she hosts bridge, she arranges dances, she dances herself. But she recently broke her ankle while she was bathing on the rocks, and so she ended up bringing down her cousin, who's Ruby, who's working as a dancer in a troupe in London. And so Ruby takes her place in the nightly review with Raymond Starr, and she then had also become close with the Jefferson family who'd been staying at the hotel at the Majestic, hence why they were the ones who called in her disappearance. Josie herself had basically assumed Ruby had run off with some boy and was shirking her duties, and hence why she had not called it in herself. So Josie identifies the body, but is strangely furious, where maybe you would think you'd be a little grief-stricken, but she's in fact really just angry at her cousin's death.
Meanwhile, Pamela Reeves, a teenage girl guide, has also gone missing, also from the area around Danemouth. And back in Danemouth at the Majestic Hotel, a Superintendent Harper is now brought in, since we are in a neighboring county. So this is now Harper in addition to Melchett and Slack. And all these various police interview the Jeffersons. So we have Addie Jefferson, who has a son from her first marriage, which also made her a widow. So she is a widow twice over, and she has little to no love lost for Ruby Keene. Mark Gaskell, her brother-in-law, also has no love lost for Ruby, and he just talks his mouth off, at times egregiously so. This character we see a lot in Christie. There are many who theorize that he's built off of Christie's brother, Monty,
right,
who was a bit of a charming ne'er-do-well who was always good in times of crisis, but at other moments was just a lot, to use modern-day parlance, just easily got in trouble, but especially among women was uber charming and got away with a lot that he shouldn't have. that definitely seems to be the kind of gentleman Mark Gaskell is. Then we also have Peter, who is Adelaide's son, who we just mentioned, and he is an obsessive mystery fan, and he is very
He has
eager.
Autographs.
He is, yes, he does. He is very eager to help the police. He explains to them that he has a souvenir, which is a fingernail of rubies that was ripped off in Josie's shawl, and that is then used to explain why the corpse had short nails, because if she had ripped off one long fingernail, then she would have had to clip all of the other nails. And those nail clippings are, in fact, found later. So that seems to solve that little mystery. And yes, so Peter is an obsessive mystery fan. And this is where we get, within this novel and just the Christie of in general, one of the oddest moments, because Agatha Christie chose to name check herself.
Yeah.
In the book. You know, he says, I have the names, the autographs of all of these authors, Dorothy Sayers, Agatha Christie. I think he also mentions John Dixon Carr and perhaps one other. I just think it supports my whole Inception sort of theory about fictional Jap versus real Jap. And obviously there's a fictional Christie versus a real Christie. And then we have the whole Partners in Crime Tommy Tuppence thing where they're aping Hercule Poirot, which is a Christie creation. So you know what? This is in keeping with the weirdness and continuity issues that we've seen before.
Agreed. We find out very quickly that Conway Jefferson had taken to Ruby, in large part because Addie had begun to ignore him in favor of, Kelsey is moving on. She's a smart, attractive 35-year-old who at this point doesn't want to be a widow forever. So, she's been trying to move on a little bit, and Conway has taken to young Ruby, who is flattering and dithering and dumb, wants to listen to him. And all around, he thinks he can be the fairy godfather to his Cinderella.
That means also 50,000 pounds.
Right.
Because Conway Jefferson had given money to Addie and Mark when they were married to his children, and he's under the impression that they still have that money, or perhaps invested it and are totally well off. But in fact, that money was burned through rather quickly, unbeknownst to him. Mark because of unrepentant gambling, Addie because her husband, prior to the plane crash, had been trying to replicate his father's success in the markets, and he lost it all. So the fact that he was going to settle 50,000 pounds on his Cinderella, Ruby Keene,
right,
actually provides a significant motive to his son-in-law and his daughter-in-law.
They really don't have any money.
Because they don't have any money. He's still not even all that aware of all of that. We are, as readers, as they begin to uncover all of this. But what Conway Jefferson does, because he's just so distraught over having lost his dear, darling Ruby, is to call in his old friend and our old friend, Sir Henry Clithering. Sir Henry, also from the 13 Problems, and he asks him to investigate Ruby's death because there just aren't enough people investigating his death at this point.
The power of rich and privileged people in these books, because one normal person would barely get Inspector Slack on it.
Yeah. Sir Henry has a different take on what this investigation requires, which is namely Miss Marple, because he sees her in the lounge, and I actually want to pull the quote of what he says about her because it's one of the best encapsulations of who Miss Marple is and what her power is. This is what he tells Conway Jefferson. Downstairs in the lounge, by the third pillar from the left, there sits an old lady with a sweet, placid, spinsterish face and a mind that has plumbed the depths of human iniquity and taken it as all in the day's work. Her name's Miss Marple. She comes from the village of St. Mary Mead, which is 1.5 miles from Gossington, and she's a friend of the Bantrys, and where crime is concerned, she's the goods. If there were ever a passage to support your Dark Marple theory, Catherine.
Oh my God. Well, I mean, some thoughts on that, but we can go on.
So, at this point, we have 5 people investigating, 6 if you include Dolly Bantry, because there's Dolly, Miss Marple, Sir Henry Clithering, Colonel Melchett, Superintendent Harper, and Inspector Slack. Wow. Not surprising that we don't actually get a lot of Miss Marple in this book. because there's just not that much room for her.
Well, also not surprising that we don't actually get that much of anybody who's being investigated in this book.
It's true, which honestly, though, I think some could speak in the book's favor, because sometimes those long interview sequences, especially if they're repeated, can be so tedious.
Yeah, are really annoying. Yeah.
And we don't get that here. There's almost no investigating that really happens.
No, it moves very quickly.
Yeah.
So we find out that Ruby was last seen dancing with George Bartlett. It's amazing he can wake up in the morning and eat breakfast and, like, survive a day. He's so dithering. And then his car's gone missing from out front of the hotel.
In his short interview, one of the things he says is, funny how difficult it is to remember anything, isn't it?
I mean, we'll cut to the chase a little here, but his car that's gone missing is later found in a ditch in a giant fire with human remains, determined to be that of the missing schoolgirl, Pamela Reeves, who had ditched her friends from the Girls' Guide trip and had supposedly gone to Woolsworth.
Yeah, and we even see them telling Pamela's parents that they found her dead, charred body.
Yeah, it's really horrible.
It's really horrible, and I note it because people talk about how Christie never portrays grief in her books, but she sometimes does when I think it makes sense, and it reminded me of that scene in Peril at End House when Cousin Maggie's parents also were informed of their daughter's death. Very similar, and I think ultimately was inserted there for similar reasons, which is that there is a dark underbelly to this story.
Oh, and by the way, we're laughing and joking about this. Story is going to get very, very dark.
Yeah, very quickly. But the laughing is also appropriate because this story is funny. It's light in the beginning. It's a fascinating dichotomy in terms of tone.
Almost nonchalant.
It's really interesting, but we'll talk more about that when we get to our rankings. So after we find out that this body is Pamela Reeves, Miss Marple sits in on the interrogations of the other girl guides before deciding to personally interrogate one of them, who reminds her of one of her maids who once withheld information from her. And she finds out from this girl that Pamela was not going to Woolworths, but had in fact been told by a movie person that she should go to a screen test in Danemouth. And then she was going to take the bus home after, but obviously she never did. So that's interesting.
After this, Miss Marple goes to the vicarage and she ends up asking permission from Griselda, who's playing with her baby.
It shows that time moves much more slowly in the Marple-verse than in the real world.
Yeah, because you should have a 12-year-old.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of Murder at the Vicarage,
Griselda's pregnant.
Is pregnant, and this baby seems to be no more than a year old at most.
Yeah, no, he crawls backwards. And it's, like, very charming, the entire sequence.
Yeah.
So she basically says, can I have your permission to essentially lie, to knock door to door and say I'm doing this on behalf of the church. So Miss Marple knocks on the door at Basil Blake's house, and it's Dinah, and she tells Dinah to knock it off. And Dinah's like, what are you talking about? And she knows that Dinah is actually Basil's wife. And she tells Dinah that he's going to be arrested for murder. And she balks, but Basil comes in, and Basil's like, oh no. But I didn't do it. Miss Marple is very concerned about where their hearthrug is. Basil says there was a body in the house, and he panicked because he'd run down from when he had fled Dinah. He left Dinah drunk at some party in London. He'd come down to make her angry and jealous, and he'd come into the house, and there was a dead body on his hearthrug. So he wrapped the body in the hearthrug, then he drove it to the Bantry's house and dumped it into the library. Minutes later, the police come.
By the time we get to the end of the world as it appears to be, we're in a familiar situation here, which is that the wrong person seems to be about to hang for murder, for sure. And only Miss Marple knows what's actually going on here. So let's go through some clues, since we are in a Miss Marple puzzle mystery. Woohoo! To get to the world as it actually is. The key here is one of our 4 L's. Thank you once again, PD James. And that would be the one that it most often is, which is lucre, money. We have a few other clues beyond that, but let's start there because it so often is about money, and it very much is in this case. Clue number 1. Jefferson was going to give Ruby Keene £50,000.
Versus if he had died without that will realignment, I think it would have gone to the children's in-law.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
No, it absolutely would have. And even though both of the widows/widowers, his children-in-law, were given money, they have none as we went through. That obviously makes them very suspicious to begin with. So we should be laser focused on both Adelaide and Mark Gaskell once we know this situation, that they have an intense need for money, and that money was about to be taken away from them. Because what he was going to do was adopt her, right, as his daughter, and then leave her £50,000 in trust. Obviously, he has to die for them to get the money at all, but she has to die first, and then he has to die, potentially naturally, but it's important for them to kill her. The deduction there is just that one of the heirs probably did it. Like, lucre is such a strong motive that we should at least always, as astute readers, if we have this super strong lucre-based motive, we should always keep that at the forefront of our minds as we're reading. So Adelaide and Mark should really be main suspects from the get-go.
And then clue number 2 are the fingernails. And this is mentioned early on, but the corpse is dressed like a cheap dancer. But her nails appear to be, like, bitten off. And a girl like that would, in the words of Miss Marple, have talons. We have a deduction here, and we think we're looking at one victim, Ruby. And Ruby would have had talons, right? And they might have been clipped off. But Miss Marple seems to think the victim had chewed off nails.
Not clipped nails.
Not clipped nails.
And it is a little unclear until we're told the solution, but the titular body in the library has short fingernails. It's unclear whether or not they've been clipped or bitten, but Miss Marple seems to think they were bitten. And let's be honest, Miss Marple's always right. So they were. That should lead a super astute reader to believe that the body in the library is not Ruby. And there is a little corollary to this, which is a devious buried clue in the 200 pages of this novel. When we are first presented with the body in the library, we are told that its teeth stick out slightly. And then Mark Gaskell makes this throwaway reference
to how her teeth go down her throat.
How her teeth run down her throat. And I actually remembered that from my earlier read, the visual of teeth running down one's throat.
It's really gross. It's like a really gross visual to have.
I'm not even quite sure what that looks like.
No, I don't know.
You know, I guess it's just that your teeth go a little inward. You know, some people's front teeth stick out. Some people's teeth go the other way. They're not perfectly straight. But that description of teeth running down one's throat, to me, I'm picturing a mythological creature, like teeth in its maw.
No, me too. No, me too.
Right?
I mean, it's like, yes, absolutely. It's a really awkward description.
You could say she's really playing fair because it sticks out. You know, that description really does stick out. And it ends up being
it sticks out like the teeth.
Yeah, right, exactly. But that too would seem to indicate that the titular body in the library perhaps is not Ruby Keene. Clue number 3, there's an extended sequence where the investigators, all being men, they're going through the bathroom that Josie and Ruby share between their 2 rooms in the Majestic Hotel. And they spend a great amount of time discussing how confusing the ladies are with all their powders and foundations, and there's just so much makeup. And Slack actually explains that theater women have this much stuff because they have to change their looks between numbers. And he says that, you know, regular ladies, they don't have to change their appearance as many times. That seems to be why there's just so much makeup and means to alter one's facial appearance in this bathroom. Deduction here would be...
Oh, no.
We may be in the realm of...
Don't say it.
Actors.
Oh, no.
Intruder alert. Intruder alert. Intruder alert. Intruder alert.
Just don't trust people who paint their faces, listeners.
Yeah.
Because Christie never grows tired of the costuming clue. And, you know, it's a quasi-actor clue because it's just more about theatricality and changing of appearance. We ran across this most recently in Evil Under the Sun in very much the same, more subtle way, to give her some credit. But this, again, goes to the notion of whether these 2 bodies are as they appear and if that really was Ruby in Gossington Hall and that really was Pamela in the car, or perhaps the two bodies were swapped and there was some sort of funny business here going on with makeup. We should just be thinking within that realm.
Clue number 4, the burnt out car, which again, giant gee, I wonder. A victim charred beyond any recognition besides the shoes and a Girl Guides button. Do you think this is significant, Kemper?
Yeah, I mean, we've come across this so many times. I think dating all the way back to the mystery of the blue train, any body that's been disfigured in any way, it's often for
be very cautious about.
And then also on the Christie Greatest Hits here, we have our final clue, clue number 5, which is timing. There is a very clear timeline here. And given our clue number 1 that we should be laser focused on Mark and Adelaide, it's interesting because Ruby, as the dancer at the Majestic, has a very clear timeline in terms of when she was dancing, when people saw her, and when she had to have been killed. And both Mark and Adelaide are accounted for during the time later in the evening that it seems Ruby would have to be killed. So that is curious, and we should be thinking that there may be some time shifting going on here because we know how Christie loves a time shift.
If you are given a very solid timeline, don't trust that for 1 second.
Right. I would point to Evil Under the Sun as well, a novel from the recent past in which a live body masqueraded as a dead body to make the murder appear to be earlier than it was. Perhaps we have one dead body masquerading as another to shift things in the other direction here. Just maybe. Let's talk about a resolution, Catherine.
This is actually really dark. And we mentioned it earlier, but I almost can't get over how grotesque the resolution is. But here we go. Mark Gaskell and Josie did it. Turns out they were married. Surprise! It's why Miss Marple has such an interest in Somerset House throughout. It's not just because of Basil Blake. And Mark would likely have received nothing if it had been discovered that he had remarried. And on top of that, really kind of by sheer accident, Ruby had been taken in as Mr. Jefferson's interest, which also had upset things.
Right. It's funny because Josie is the one who brought Ruby into the Majestic and ended up making matters much more complicated for her and Mark. Because then Conway Jefferson took an interest in her. So there's it was almost like a double lucre motive in the end because he already had a problem in that he had remarried, but then also they had the whole Ruby thing. So Miss Marple, knowing that they are the killers, does what Miss Marple likes to do. She sets traps for murderers.
It's a huge trap. By the way, if you were anybody working with Miss Marple, would you be like, okay, that sounds super cool. I will just participate in your trap.
Well, it's kind of funny because I think not that every Poirot novel ends in a grand denouement in front of all of the suspects assembled and then a subsequent full confession. But many of them do. Or we often have 2 or 3 people in a room. Sometimes it's even Poirot just directly with the murderer and this dramatic scene that ends in a full confession. Because Miss Marple is not a dramatic person, at least the way that Christie is portraying her, or doesn't like to be the center of attention in the same way. She then often comes to rely on
sets traps.
Yeah, on this trope of setting a trap because she's not going to get the confession. She's not going to have the dramatic grand denouement. So we will see this again a lot, I believe, in the Miss Marple novels. So what she does is that she entices Josie and Mark to try to kill Mr. Jefferson.
Yeah.
Because he talks about how he's going to, in fact, give away that 50,000 pounds he had been holding in trust for Ruby.
Dancing school.
Yeah, to a girls' dancing school. So, of course, they need to kill him before he can change his will yet again. And the police catch Josie with a syringe filled with digitalin. We've seen that poison before. Does not do good things to one's heart.
Nope.
And then we get our full explanation as to...
Which is, by the way, it's a full explanation. It goes on for many pages.
It does. And it's horrifying because here's what happened. Josie and Mark more or less seduced poor Pamela Reeves, this innocent girl guide, who looked a little bit like Ruby, but not even that much. And they seduced her with these dreams of the silver screen. They convinced her to come to a screen test, which involved dyeing her hair platinum and making her up to look like Ruby, painting her fingernails, etc. And then they drugged her. Then Mark brought her to Basil Blake's house because they figured Basil Blake would be an easy patsy, given the company that he keeps, and strangled her and left her dead on his hearthrug. And then later on in that evening, after Ruby was visible as being in the Majestic Hotel and Mark and Josie are in there, they drugged Ruby as well. Poor drugged Ruby is carried out to a stolen car, driven a few miles away. The car is torched with Pamela's shoes in it to make it seem as though it was her.
So the body in the library is Pamela's. It's not Ruby. So it was meant to confound timing and to provide some alibis.
This was all done for £50,000. Mark and Josie are going to the gallows. Miss Marple is super happy about that since she is a big fan of capital punishment.
Oh my God. Miss Marple loves capital punishment.
It makes her very happy to think about them being executed. It's
really kind of weird.
Adelaide gets to marry her boring beau, who we didn't even mention because he's not a suspect, but he just sticks around.
He's like hanging around in the tennis courts and
Hugo. They'll, be in wedded bliss with Conway Jefferson's blessing, who is also going to formally adopt Peter, the mystery-loving son of Adelaide, as his grandson. So that's nice. And the Bantrys are free to go about their normal lives. Dolly can focus on her gardening again. And Basil Blake and Dinah Lee can sail right into the sunset of wedded bliss / Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, knockdown, drag out fighting.
In the end.
Before we get to our rankings, let's talk really briefly about the adaptations, because we have two, as we so often do, of any Miss Marple novel. The first is the BBC adaptation that aired right around Christmas in 1984, and this was actually the first episode of the Joan Hickson Miss Marple series. Those had been a long time in the making. There was actually a BBC producer who had established a really strong personal relationship with Agatha Christie's daughter, Rosalind Hicks. So in the years after Christie passed away, and they were making these decisions as to whether or not they were actually going to take the plunge and adapt Miss Marple for the small screen, because it had not gone so well on the large screen with Margaret Rutherford in the 60s. We know there are a lot of big fans of Margaret Rutherford, and she was doing something specific and something her own, but they finally figured out a formula that worked, and a big part of that was having Joan Hickson play Miss Marple. We did mention in Appointment with Death, when we covered it, that Joan Hickson played a small role in the play, the theatrical adaptation of Appointment with Death that Christie wrote, and that she then wrote to her afterwards saying, "I do hope that one day you play my dear Miss Marple." To me, that feels a little apocryphal. I wonder if that actually happened, but hey, it's nice to think that it did. We also did see Joan Hickson in a very small role in the 1980 adaptation of Why Didn't They Ask Evans? So certainly not her first Christie. I'm a big fan of the Joan Hickson series. As I so often do, I'm going to rely on our good friend Mark Aldrich for a pithy quote that captures how I feel about the series, because what he said is, like Agatha Christie's Poirot 5 years later, this is a confident series that is almost fully formed from the very first episode, something that is unusual for television. I think that's absolutely true. I think this is the adaptation that purists tend to like. I think Joan Hickson just does an excellent job of capturing the intelligence of Miss Marple.
We haven't had a lot of opportunity to talk about Joan Hickson, but I think that her warmth sometimes overshadows the fact that there is a steely intelligence underneath it. And that's what I really love about it. Clearly, this is somebody you should kind of be afraid of. Yeah. Not just to go to my Dark Marple theory.
Yeah. And Joan Hickson captures the two faces of the character so well.
Perfectly.
And it's not just Hickson. I was struck in rewatching the adaptation for this episode that it's extremely faithful. And I think you can tell that this was the very beginning of the relationship with the Christie estate. So the BBC bent over backwards to be about as faithful as those early 80s adaptations had been to some of those standalone novels. We mentioned that this isn't a short Christie novel. It's barely over 200 pages. This is a 180-minute adaptation. It's 3 episodes long. And a lot of the subsequent Miss Marples within the Joan Hickson series were 60 minutes long of other novels. So there is almost no deviation from the plot. However, one of the very few is at the very beginning, and there's this wonderful short scene in which Miss Marple is instructing her maid how to properly light a fire.
Yes, that's quite nice, Esther. Now always remember to make it into a nice pointy mountain Just like that, and not a dumpy hill.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes. Well, the brass looks quite smart. Yes, well done.
Thank you, ma'am.
And it's so well done because just within 30 seconds, you get the kindness with which Miss Marple is treating her maid, but the firmness, because she's no fool and she wants this maid to do it right. And also the intelligence. That just all comes through, and we're like barely a minute into the series. That's Joan Hickson, but it's also well written and well directed. For me, we can quibble about certain things that these adaptations do or don't do, but I think they're generally firing on all cylinders and performing the job of adaptation quite well.
Yeah, I agree completely. I think it's a really good adaptation, and I think she's wonderful. But I mean, I've said that before, so.
Yeah. And then we won't belabor because we've also talked about our feelings on the later adaptation.
Do you want to talk about that?
So the ITV adaptation, which aired a week or two before Christmas, actually in 2004, this is also the first episode of this iteration of Miss Marple. And this starred Geraldine McEwen, who did it for the first 3 seasons. And it's really interesting. And this is actually theory that is not coming from me. This is coming from our very good friend, Jamie Bernthal, who noted that, and I'm quoting from him here, in many ways, Marple, this is the ITV's Marple, is a conscious reworking of the BBC's Miss Marple. For one thing, both series begin with versions of The Body in the Library, followed in each case by the murder at the vicarage, and then a murder is announced, which does not reflect Christie's chronology. For another, both series are set in the 1950s. And I never really thought about it that way, but I think he's absolutely right, because the ITV Marple series knows that the Joan Hickson Miss Marple series exists, and the ethos from the beginning was clearly, we want to do something different. We want to be,
We want to have some neon lettering and
we want to be jaunty. We want to be irreverent. We want to shock and surprise the viewer a little bit. We've talked a lot about what we don't appreciate in this series. For the most part, this adaptation as the first within the ITV series, I actually think is pretty good. First of all, Joanna Lumley plays Dolly Bantry.
Okay. How could you not love that?
I would argue it has not just Joanna Lumley, it has Tara Fitzgerald, who I really like a lot, as Adelaide Jefferson, and Ian Richardson as Conway Jefferson. I don't really feel like Joanna Lumley was capturing Dolly Bantry on the page, but it was Joanna Lumley on the screen, so I was extremely happy every time anything came out of her mouth.
Oh, Jane, I'm so glad you've come.
Oh, Dolly, what a terrible thing.
I know. Rather thrilling, isn't it?
But I would say that this adaptation is also indicative of the larger series because it's pretty faithful with minor alterations until we get to the end, where the big change is that instead of it being Josie Turner and Mark Gaskell, it is Josie Turner and Adelaide Jefferson because they are lesbian lovers. And, here's the thing, and we've talked about this before, so we won't talk about it for very long, but there's just no nuance in the way that they introduce homosexual romances or themes or issues in the alterations that they're making here. So it feels reductive. But there's an argument to be made, and our friend Jamie argues it quite persuasively and convincingly in his book, Queering Agatha Christie, that in a deeper textual analysis of Christie herself, there is lots of room for alternate readings of
for sure
different things going on there. By putting it in the forefront and using such a wide brushstroke, it's just erasing any of those nuances and subtleties that give it value, which you could argue are in the text itself. So it's almost doubly offensive because they're erasing it in the text and also just not doing it well anyway.
Right.
To me, it's a big reason why those adaptations leave me with a bad taste, despite the beautiful color saturation, the wonderful costumes, and the often brilliant performances by unquestionably brilliant actors, which we have here. There was also an adaptation of it done in France recently as part of The Little Murders of Agatha Christie, but those are really doing something different and making lots of alterations. And we haven't watched it because we're not covering non-English language adaptations, but just an FYI to listeners in case they're interested.
Maybe we should be.
We only have so much time, Catherine.
On that note, we should get to our rankings, I suppose.
Yes. Let's talk about rankings, starting with plot mechanics.
I think it's very solid. I give this a grade B+.
I think that's fair. A lot of people think of The Body in the Library as Christie's pastiche novel where she's parodying or sending up a lot of tropes within the detective genre itself. Of course, most famously, the title. And I don't think we mentioned it yet, but in Cards on the Table, there's reference made to an early Ariadne Oliver novel, and its title is The Body in the Library, because it's such a cliched title. And Christie has this charming foreword to later editions of the novel where she talks about always wanting to do this idea because it's such a cliche. She clearly is having a lot of fun with it. The idea is well formed. And even though it's a pretty basic plot mechanical device of a switcheroo with two dead bodies and temporal deception thereby, I think there's a lot to be said for it. Here's my short spiel on plot credibility. P.D. James actually has a great quote about this novel specifically, which I found in Laura Thompson's biography of Christie, where she talks about how ludicrous the plot is. And as much as I love P.D. James, I actually disagree with her, because here's what she says. Now, here we are expected to believe that this blonde dancer who they wanted to get out of the way, and they could quite easily have murdered the old man, put a pillow over his face. Instead, we have this extraordinary plot in which they kidnap a girl guide who doesn't look anything like her. For one thing, the time sequence is impossible. Anyone would know that to dye a brunette blonde, you've got to bleach the hair first, and it would take hours and be quite a skilled job. The pathologist would know just by looking at the other hair on her body that this is not a natural blonde. Her point about why don't they just kill the old man, I don't think is true, because Christie has that extra wrinkle that he's leaving money to her. So if they just kill him, the money's going to go to Ruby. Right?
Yeah, no, that's right. I mean, I would say, and my quibble with it would be that if they had dyed her hair, the smell of bleach. I am a woman who has, at one point in my youth, dyed my hair blonde. And that smell does not get out of anything.
But wouldn't they just think that Ruby Keene dyes her hair? And she probably did, right?
I'm sure she dyed her hair, but nobody who even approached the body would have been like, oh my God, it's like fumes would have come off of it. That's the biggest problem with this, is that they dye her hair and then they do it so quickly. That's ridiculous. The credibility issue there is like shot.
I think that's fair, and we've come across issues like that in past Christies. For some reason, I'm reminded of Sad Cypress, where part of the plot hinges on that nurse having to vomit badly into a basin. And then
it's
just
like you wouldn't smell the vomit.
Right. I mean, I think Eleanor Carlisle would have been like, why does it smell like puke in this little kitchen area here? I think that's fair. I just, we don't want to fall into the trap we always worry about falling into, where we're just docking points because it's a Rube Goldberg sort of.
No, and that's fine. I mean,
that's the fun of these mysteries,
car thing, whatever. But I mean, the hair dye thing is like a legitimate. Christie would have known that.
I keep on going back to Evil Under the Sun, but there are just so many similarities. The sequence in which Christine Redfern is putting body bronzer on her skin to make her skin darker. It's ridiculous, but she accounts for how it would be technically possible. This is pretty unbelievable that they would have been able to pull off a dye job.
It takes several hours to bleach out somebody's hair. But
you know what I think we should do is a 7 and a 5.
All right. I could, 7 and a 5 would be good.
Okay. Going now to series long characters. We touched on this. We don't have to talk about it for too long, but this is a book in which Miss Marple does not appear nearly enough.
No.
I think for either of us, very much for me, because it's crowded out by so many other investigators. What saves this category is all of the incidental St. Mary Mead characters. We talked about how much we love Dolly Bantry and Colonel Bantry and Griselda and her baby, and even those other spinsterish women in St. Mary Mead, or name checked, who we saw in Murder at the Vicarage.
I love me some Dolly in this, and Sir Henry's good in it. I mean, I came out very strong on this only because it's mostly series-long characters in this book. That's mostly who's populating the book. Maybe an 8? I
was going to give it a 6.
Oh, you were going to give it a 6?
Yeah. When we say series-long characters, we really mean
Marple.
We really mean Miss Marple. But I think it's a legitimate point that there are a lot of the St. Mary Mead characters. Like, Miss Marple books are often about all of the other people that populate St. Mary Mead around her, and this book acquits itself well. I could do a 7.
I would do a 7.
Okay. So then book-specific characters, I think we agree, is where this book probably does the worst.
Yeah, that's not great. They're not there, really.
They're really not there. Like, all the characters we cherish and have been talking about for this entire episode are the series-long characters. Josephine Turner is probably the best out of all of them. The description of her as having a distinct touch of the nursery governess about her was an effective description, and I
agree.
I often talk about Christie not being good at description, so I want to give her credit where it's due. George Bartlett was just, again, so dumb that I didn't believe he existed. Raymond Starr has a deeply bronzed face. She makes another reference to his suntanned face. Good Lord. We're supposed to care a lot more about him than we do, too. Like, there's this weird button at the end of the novel where he finds out
that she's engaged.
That Adelaide
and, you're supposed to, and you're supposed to feel bad for him.
Because I guess he was trying to put the moves on her and get her to marry him. And then she ends up marrying Hugo. And he's like, I will just go back and dance because that is all that I can do. And I was like, okay. Where did you come out on book-specific characters? 5?
I came out on a 5.
That's fair. And then setting and tone, we referenced the first 2 pages, which really are superb. They're great. It's a great introduction. Great. And
after that, it's a little iffier.
I suppose I like the economy with which this story is told, because it really is short. It almost feels like a long novella.
Yeah, it does, actually.
Right?
I agree.
Because it's so simple and it's so fast. And for most of it, a delightful read in terms of light, witty banter. And then it just turns pitch dark. And you're like, oh my God, they singled out this girl guide just because they literally needed a body.
They set her, they killed her and then they set the other car on fire. It's horrible.
It's really, really bad. But I find that fascinating, and that's so Christie-ish. And that's my ultimate feeling about this book, which is that this is a very Christie-ish Christie novel. It's just that we get less of it than we normally do because it's so short.
I think the tone is really interesting. I think the setting is not. If you got me to describe one thing about the hotel, I'd be surprised.
Fair enough.
I have no idea.
Fair enough. But part of it takes place in St. Mary Mead. The setting of St. Mary Mead is always wonderful.
What I do really love about the setting is the cottage in which Basil Blake lives and the disdain towards it.
Yeah. I'm now on this obsession with referencing of real life murder cases because I think it really belies the notion that Christie books are airy and fairy and not based in reality at all that so many people have about reading Christie and readers of Christie. But she references the Rouse case, which is this horrifying case involving the blazing car murderer who strangled a hitchhiker and burned his body. And then also the Brighton trunk murders, which, as you could imagine, involve women being stuffed into the trunks of cars. And that goes along with the horror of this murder plot. It's what Christie does, and I think often does in these Miss Marple novels, which is that there's a light, airy, bantery quality to everything that's going on at the surface. But then once we know what actually is happening underneath, it's horrifying and it's psychotic.
Right.
And other than the one exact moment in which the murderers are unmasked, it never actually is allowed to come up for air or is never allowed to infect the atmosphere that she's creating. And some people cite that in a critical way, saying like, oh, this is her just like not wanting to be real. But I would argue it's the exact opposite. She's showing what is often hidden underneath as we live out our everyday lives in, I think, a really powerful way, and doing it in the course of a book that is extremely pleasant and pleasurable to read. But I think that message does come across when you finish it, if you think about it in a somewhat deeper way. And that to me is one of the most Christie-ish things that she does. And she doesn't do it in every novel, but I think she does it really well in this novel, and she does it in 200 pages, So like, I agree with you. Setting is weak, but I think tone is strong.
I understand everything that you're saying, but I just think that she's done everything better elsewhere.
Really? I don't. That duality, she often isn't really doing it. Like, she's not doing it, for example, in a book like And Then There Were None. She didn't do it as well by any means in Murder at the Vicarage, even though that's where we started with Miss Marple. And I think she will do it better in subsequent Miss Marples, but I think this is a really good example of it. I think there's a reason why also both of the series that adapted her started with The Body in the Library. It's not the first Miss Marple, but it feels like a very Miss Marple-ish Miss Marple. And I don't know if tone is even the right thing. This has become our catch-all category, but to me, it's just indicative of the skill.
I would still prefer Murder at the Vicarage over this.
Certainly, Murder at the Vicarage is still going to be ranked much higher. Like, that's no question.
I mean, if you want to give it a 7, it's fine.
Okay, and then I would actually take off no deductions for Stuck in Its Time.
I don't know. There's like a lot of stuff about like ladies' clothing that made me uncomfortable. There's like slut shaming in it that's like really hard.
Oh, yeah. I actually wrote down the worst one for me anyway, which was Superintendent Harper thinking about Ruby Keene. And here's what Christie writes. Ruby Keene, so he admitted privately, might have asked for what was coming to her.
Yeah. A bunch of them think that she had what she was coming to her. And Miss Marple says a bunch of times, like, well, if it were somebody of our class.
Yeah.
And it's like really gross.
And there's a whole sense in terms of the dichotomy between Ruby Keene and Pamela Reeves, that Pamela Reeves was innocent, that she didn't deserve to be killed. The implication being,
except for the fact that we know from the autopsy that Ruby was Virgo intacto.
No, that was Pamela Reeves's body.
Oh, yeah, it was Pamela Reeves's body.
It's funny that you say that because I thought the same thing. And I was like, oh, but that's interesting.
You're totally right.
No, and then I realized that. And then I was like, I actually think that might be a clue.
Ew.
Yeah. I think that might be a little bit of a clue because perhaps Ruby was not. And also the phrase Virgo intacta is just...
It's really gross and icky. It was so icky. I read it and I was like, that's so icky.
However, for me, I think that all of these things are where we have to give her the benefit of the doubt because they're all in the mouths of other people.
No, it's true. It's just there's so much of it where it's like, oh, well, Ruby Keene is basically a worthless corpse who can be thrown away and who cares?
Right. That's also, to me, part of that pitch dark undertone of this where, oh, yes, ha, 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 Dolly Bantry, who we love and is so delightful, is what a lark that there's this useless body in my library of some cheap hussy. That's part of it, too. Right. This could be one case where if we revisit in the future, we might want to use that opportunity if we think it needs to be a little lower to give it a deduction, because I think those are all valid points. But
I mean, I don't like the idea that the victim is meaningless. She's like a worthless flesh sack. Christie doesn't normally do that, and I find it disturbing in this book that she does.
I just feel like when we're talking obviously about xenophobia or anti-Semitism or any of those issues, we know that those issues are of their time and don't have any utility. But I think you could make the argument that those admittedly yucky class issues, there is some utility in terms of the story that she's trying to tell.
Right. I just think that we should all learn a lesson that the body in the library is not just a body. She was a person and she died.
That brings us to a grand total of 7 plus 5.
at a morbid point.
Yeah, on that note. That brings us to a grand total of 7 plus 5 plus 7 plus 5 plus 7 minus 0. 31 points, putting The Body in the Library in a tie with The Sittaford Mystery and Lord Edgware Dies. And I believe that we are in agreement that it should go between those two.
Correct.
Above
Sittaford, below Lord Edgware.
Right. And that will put it in 14th place overall. Our first Miss Marple, The Murder at the Vicarage, is currently in 5th place with much higher marks.
It is delightful.
Because it is delightful and with much higher marks in every category except for setting and tone. That brings us to an end of The Body in the Library. I am so excited to now be in the Marpleverse once more, and we will be hitting Miss Marple much sooner.
Oh, I'm gonna have some hardcore Dark Marple theories.
I can't wait. Join us next time for a change of pace with a short story. We will be covering the next within the Listerdale Mystery Collection, Mr. Eastwood's Adventure. And our next novel will be... Catherine.
5 Little Pigs! Our next novel will be 5 Little Pigs, which I might be a little bit excited about. I don't know.
Catherine can barely contain her excitement.
I can barely contain it.
I, too, am excited for that one. Perhaps not quite as excited as Catherine, but considerably excited. And we would love to hear from you in the meantime. You can always email us at allaboutthedame@gmail.com or find us on Twitter at allaboutthedame. You can find Catherine at Brobcat. Our Facebook page is All About Agatha, and our Instagram handle is at allaboutagatha. And we would really appreciate it if you took a moment to rate and review us. It helps others find the podcast, and we love hearing from you. And we'll see you next time. Bye.
Bye.